We're gathered here in a strange, small congregation in the open air, as if to celebrate a significant moment in the city's history, coming out of or almost emerging from one of the plagues of the city that come along fairly frequently. And one of the aspects of this has been a release of history. Just chatting to the other people who are here now, a lot of whom would know more about local history of the area than I do, what is so absolutely clear is that it's multi-layered, it's shifting day to day, history is not resolved. We put up signs and symbols to teach us things, but they're generally slightly wrong, and maybe a missing place. It's up for revision, and so history is ongoing, and history is the responsibility of all of the citizens who belong here and who engage with the past to know themselves better. So Swedenborg's font, as I call it, is not Swedenborg's font, but the font of the Eureka Elenora Swedish Church, which I think was the first sort of official Swedish church in London, stood in a position here. It moves around a little, and it was an object that I looked at a lot on my walks. And one of the ways of reading a city is by moving across it constantly and realigning what you think you know. And what's fascinating is the places that are not there, but they are there. There's a great sense of presence in absence, and this is one of them. The church, the Swedish church, is not actually on this spot, although it's remembered, and in fact it was never on this spot. As Stephen from Swedenborg House was telling me, it was actually a short distance away, and the place where the theologian and mystic is buried was under the altar of that church, in a crypt which would have been across there, a site possibly now marked by an apple tree, which is something very significant to me, as we'll come back to. But each of these sites which is not a site is also generally marked by some strange and curious object. A piece of granite, a stone, a rock, something fixed and rooted into the city. Before I think of this site, I think of a similar site in Whitechapel, the Church of St. Mary Matfelon. And this was the church that gave Whitechapel its name. It was a white chapel, 14th century chapel. And in the days when I worked around Brick Lane in the brewery and was beginning to explore London, the outline of that church was marked in a little park. It was known as Mary Matfelon Park. The church wasn't there, but the outline was in the grass, a ghost outline. And the drinking schools and the people who tended to live and sleep on the garden and used it as an oasis never actually stepped inside the church that wasn't there. They stood around the last surviving monument, which was a sepulchre with a symbol on the top of it. And the interesting thing was, at the entrance to the park was a stone, what looked like a stone head drinking fountain, but it was a sort of monstrous stone head. It always reminded me of the Elephant Man, Joseph Merrick, the figure that's kept. I walked past the London Hospital, the Royal London Hospital, on my way down here, and the remains of the Elephant Man, the effigy, is in the hospital museum. And at the entrance to Mary Matfelon Park is this object, this stone object. And the drinking fountain had a hole in it, and if you put your eye to that hole, you could look precisely onto the single surviving monument in the church, and the church that wasn't there. So there was the object, there was the outline, and there was memory provoked. And that led you on to walk a bit further. And when we came here to a place that shifts from Princess Gardens, Swedenborg Gardens, to now this curated space with two of the people associated with the church remembered, the same thing happens because there's a font, a stone granite font, which is rather mysterious. On one side of it, on the south side of the font, you see the church itself, Eureka, Elenora, seemingly on a raft. It's on a scooped craft of some kind, like a floating ark. And that obviously suggests the nature of the river, the Thames, which was much closer at that point, the docks where Swedish boats and Danish boats would come in, the Danish church, which was a little further down in Well-Close Square by Sibbe, father of Collie Sibbe, the Swedish church here. There were these associations. And on the other side of the font, which is chipped, is a message inscribed which says Rosa inter spinas, a rose among thorns. Now that's quite a curious thing, and that sets up another chain of associations, because going back straight down Cannon Street Road into New Road, as if that was a river running north, you would see right by the London Hospital Rose Peri Peri Grill. It's a little restaurant there that's standing on the spot of something else that's missing, the Whitechapel Mound. There was a pyramidical mound with a grove of trees on the top that stood there beside London Hospital. And now there's this association with the Rose. You find the Rose again here. You cross the highway, there's a pub called the Old Rose. You're tapping into subliminal notions of Rosicrucianism, the Rosy Cross, the sense of a system of magic beneath the city that people tapped into, particularly Swedenborg, who's become a totemic figure for people who want to think of the city as not only living, but in association with the dead. The dead are always migrating, the dead are always moving, they're always revising the story. Wonderful to see a series of old maps laid out there before we began the talk, and the maps showed ghostly prints of what had been here before and how it aligned, so that you understood that when the Swedish Church was here, just a little further, much more clearly, was Nicholas Hawksmoor's St George in the East, one of a series of churches that are very notable for their presence in East London. The church itself now is a kind of shell because of bombing. The core of the church was lost and a new church was inserted into it, but the church itself was there. And it's another of the curious links that the church is connected with a series of heads. One of the things that with Swedenborg, one of the most astonishing legends, myths, documented and otherwise of Swedenborg, is how after he'd died and been buried in the church, as I explained under the altar, in 1816, a kind of resurrectionist party in the age of the great phrenologists, when it was thought to be a way of acquiring power, was to take the heads of notable people, went into the church, cut off the head of Swedenborg, who was sealed in 3 layers of coffin, and took it away. And a year later, the head was replaced by a ringer, a copy that was brought from somewhere, possibly by the same church official or verger who had arranged the first theft. And that false head was sent back with the body of Swedenborg to Sweden on a warship from Dartmouth in 1910, I think. And so that was interred in Uppsala, and the real head, authenticated head, emerged eventually in Swansea, and was a subject of a poem by Vernon Watkins, who was a friend of Dylan Thomas and a notable Welsh poet and enthusiast for W.B. Yeats. So you have this head of Swedenborg which goes missing and reappears, and in the Crown and Dolphin pub, which is just there, it overlooks a crossroads of Cannon Street Road and Cable Street, and in the point of the crossing was buried the body of John Williams, supposedly the Ratcliffe Highway murderer of 1811, written about by Thomas de Quincey in a famous essay on murder considered as one of the fine arts. What happened was that there'd been a series of brutal murders of 2 families, the Marrs and the Williamsons, very close to the highway, And the local populace was enraged and wanted some form of ritual ceremony when the man accused of this murder committed suicide in prison. And so this man, John Williams, was taken on a cart to St. George in the East and around the sites of the murders, and was eventually buried in a pit at this crossroads just there, and the head was removed and a stake was driven through his heart. So you have a sense of these prophetic heads somehow floating around looking for location, the same time as the buildings which are here and not here, and always the strong presences of granite stones. If you just walked up Cannon Street Road a short way and off to the left, behind a block of fairly anonymous public housing flats is an enormous granite boulder. It's like a meteor has dropped there. It's never been explained to me, but it's one of those things that act as radio beacons. As we walk along the city, we bounce our waves off these objects and so confirm our own sense of identity. And this place has them more than any. It's so haunted. It's meant a lot to me from the days in the early 70s when I was working as a council gardener in Limehouse. I was based in St. George's Fields, and my job, which was a very fortunate job, was to cut the grass of St. Anne's Limehouse, St. George in the East, sometimes along here, sometimes down on the Isle of Dogs, and to spend my time in between sessions sitting in the Land Rover with the old gardeners who knew the place inside out and listening to their stories and remembering their stories and acquiring that verbal sense of history which is sort of common to all indigenous peoples. I've just been in Peru, and the history there wasn't a written history among the Ashaninka people I was in. It was a history largely in song and dance, and they would meet strangers who would come along from a different tribal grouping and add something to their own song, and so history became an accumulation. And history was also very associated with the river, because there were two languages there. One was called Down River and one was called Up River, and it depended which way they were facing as to which way they would talk. And I've always felt that about London. The looking down river is an opening up to a particular kind of version of plural history, which again plays back to this point. And so I think really at that time, cutting the grass here was much more of a sense of wildness, of being in some kind of grove that was separated from all this noise of traffic, all the council work we were doing, all the flats that were being built or taken down, the endless revision of the city. This was a sort of Edenic place to chill out, to hide away, sit under a tree and to think. And it was at that point that I developed the notion that, knowing about Swedenborg coming to London in 1710, under his ship, under a threat of quarantine. This brings it right into the present moment, because there'd been plague in Sweden, and when a ship arrived, it was docked in quarantine for 6 weeks, and you weren't allowed to come ashore. It was a terrible journey. They went aground on a sandbank. They were assaulted by pirates who put themselves forward as being Danish but were actually French. They were fired on by a British patrol ship, and eventually Swedenborg slips off on a yacht, breaks the quarantine, comes ashore to All Hallows on the Isle of Grain, rides 16 miles by horseback to Gravesend and comes into London and is arrested and challenged. Now at that time, if you broke quarantine, you weren't able to say you had an absolution not to wear a mask. You were hanged. It was quite fairly straightforward and quite effective. But because of his connections, his father, Bishop, who had been associated with the first patronage of the first Lutheran church that was here before this Swedish Church, he got off and he slipped into London. But from that moment, he was, to me, a person who was already leading a second life. He'd been given another life, and a kind of London life, and the chance to associate with Flamsteed and Halley and to listen to Isaac Newton, the kind of emerging grains of the Enlightenment, the scientific Enlightenment. And so he gets into that. But in my mythical version of it, he comes ashore with the Swedish boats there at the dock. He finds himself sitting in this garden, I imagined under and actually under an apple tree, which is amazingly now I discover where he is actually buried. And I knew nothing about the truth of the real landfall. I had my own version. And I think the thing is that your own versions, the fictive versions, become just as significant. They become part of the myth. You write them, someone else picks up on them, and they become repeated over and over again. All that we know, really know, is what we've walked and touched and sounded and seen, and everything else is a kind of version of curating the past by invading it, by colonizing it, and by labeling it. And I think with this sentence here about Emanuel Swedenborg, it's nice to have that reference, but being pedantic, I think there's either something missing or something added. We need a comma, because otherwise it's Emanuel Swedenborg, comma, a Swedish theologian and polymath lodged in him. Otherwise, Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish the comma there is redundant. So even something as tiny as that slightly revises what we know and what we're being told. And the effect of development and regeneration is always to pitch another version of history, to give you a version. There are only two people referenced here in this, associated with this church. There's Swedenborg, and there's the botanist Daniel Solander, who also came to London and sailed with Captain James Cook on his first Pacific voyage. And Solander was therefore the first Swede to navigate the entire world, circumnavigate the globe. And he was a disciple and pupil of Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus, who knew Swedenborg, and he came to England to pontificate on behalf of Linnaeus' system of categorization. It's associated with the British Museum. It's a very nice sense of migrant energies coming here. Nobody mentions a third figure, Thomas Day, the poet, 18th century poet, who with John Bicknell wrote a poem called The Dying Negro, which was on the death of a runaway slave. So slavery, which has now become a major topic, was also part of this story and was not really touched upon in the first versions of curated history. Some things just slip out of the story. I think of the things that are there and not there. I'm reminded also of the Rachel Whiteread great art project House, which she did on Wennington Green near Roman Road. And this was a casting of the interior of a terraced house that had belonged to a man called Sidney Gale. Some of the terrace had been destroyed by V-2 rockets in the Second World War. What was remaining was this sense of capturing and holding history by making this cast. And this object stood there in this park, and people from all over London came to it, migrated, cultural pilgrimages. They turned up there, they looked at this thing, but there was also a sense that it was only going to be there for a short time. So it was a solid object, like one of these objects I've been talking about, but it was also doomed. It was going to place anywhere, it was going to be in your memory. There was a huge debate around it, but the council had given permission for it to be there for a certain length of time, and then it was demolished. And there were a lot of people who fought and said this should stay here. It was something that brought people to the area, that people would think about what it was like to have lived in one of these houses. But no, it disappeared completely, and there's no plaque, there's nothing there now. And in fact, I don't mind that. I think this was an event that's strengthened by it being forced to become just another memory event which we repeat, we tell stories about, and then it's gone, absolutely gone. And nearby, just like this, there is a tree. And often I've found, curiously enough, people tend to leave coins, small brown coins, around this tree, like a kind of votive offering, in the same way that they used to do that in William Blake's, the gravestone in Bunhill Fields, that represented the memory of William Blake and his wife Catherine. But it turned out that this was not where they were actually buried. It's about the same distance as here. Blake was actually buried a little further along under a tree where there's now a new plaque, and he was buried with a bunch of other people. It was a common grave, and the names of those other people are completely forgotten. They're people from Bethnal Green, elderly ladies, widows. He was just one among many, but his history is such that he becomes a plaque, he becomes part of the story. Swedenborg is part of a story, but what is that story? It's a story of renaming, remaking, rethinking, coming back, doing what we're doing now. We're over there, Well Close Square has been kind of obliterated. There are traces of it. The Danish church became St. Paul's School. And that conjures up another figure, very, very classically part of the same sort of story. The same tradition of people who refuse to accept that history exists in linear bands, and who also won't accept the borders between life and death. The curate of that church, St. George in the East, in 1861 was a man called Joseph Lester Lyne, who called himself Father Ignatius, and he tried to invent his own Benedictine order. He was a strange, eccentric individual. And while he was here, he was a St. Saviour's Church was his responsibility. He was called out one night to a sick young woman called Lizzie Meath, who was living around the Well Close Square area, and she died, apparently. And he sits with her through the night and brings her back to life. And this, of course, is a scandal within the Anglican Church. I mean, it's a kind of self-professed miracle. What the real story is, who knows? But this man and the self-invention and the idea that it has to happen there sits so nicely with figures like Rabbi Falk, who was living somewhere close to Well Close Square, and who was an associate and sparring partner, as far as I understand, with Swedenborg. And when Swedenborg is staying in the inn there, in his black, dusty velvet clothes, stalking out to walk around, living, it seems, on coffee and breakfast, he's talking to Falk, who has this reputation as a Kabbalist. He had been pretty much expelled from Westphalia on the grounds of sorcery, and myths start to accumulate around him in London. One of which takes us back to Mary Matfelon and Whitechapel, because he was seen in a cart coming along Whitechapel to go out to Epping Forest, where supposedly he was burying great treasures, whether they were real treasures or spiritual treasures, who knows. And as he passes Matfelon, one of the wheels came off the cart and followed him, just rolled along independently all the way out to Epping Forest. He's also associated with the notion of the golem, as if he went down to the Thames mud and drew it into his house, and by ritual created a robotic entity to service the Jewish community. When Falk died, he was buried in the Jewish cemetery in Alderney Road, and that became the locale of W.G. Sebald's documentary novel, fictive version of London, Austerlitz. Austerlitz lives overlooking this cemetery and brooding on such things as the secret alternative history of London and Falk. And he goes into Tower Hamlets Cemetery after being in the hospital there, after suffering a breakdown, a series of enormous walks, sort of psychogeographic rambles across London at night as he tries to recover himself after some terrible trauma. He goes into the Tower Hamlets Cemetery and finds a particular grave with an angel, and that became like the angel of history for him, as if the angel of history could no longer lift off, but was there in Tower Hamlets Cemetery, which was where I used to always take my picnic lunches every day when I was working as a gardener. It was a great place to cycle to. And it was another of these wildernesses. It was another, so overgrown at that time. You didn't know whether memory was the names of the people that were being erased and disappearing from the gravestones, or whether the memory was with the angels who couldn't take off, or whether it was just the communication, the sap running between the trees themselves, which were more significant in a sense as nature took over, until the cemetery itself has now become much more curated. The paths are organized, there are sort of eco benefits, there's teaching devices, there are labels and stories. But these little labels and stories, although they're very useful in a sense for letting children or people who don't want to get information know, in a sense they're also taking something away. You know, the way that we have to discover the city for ourselves, the way we have to move around and do that. And I'd like to just read a little piece, which is an extract from something that was published in the Swedenborg House magazine, but it's about a Swedenborgian walk. Because I met a Spanish poet translator who lives in Brussels, and actually had to work on the Brexit negotiations, so he was in a deeply traumatized state, and I thought Swedenborg was probably the best antidote. So I met him in the station at King's Cross, and we walked to a site which Stephen had led me to, which was the chop house of Swedenborg's vision and the places where he lived. And then, without intending it, we found ourselves drifting this way. These kind of objects and stones and obelisks were all leading us in this direction, until the rain finally broke on us and we were standing under this tree. And I thought that gives you a sense of how this works. Light thickens, and I'm swept along a subterranean stream, following links, real or imagined, between obelisks, church towers, charity barracks, poverty pits, hospital museums, rag trade sweatshops, and wedding display windows, back to the wilderness garden between Ratcliffe Highway and Cable Street, behind tall flats hiding St George in the east from the ground where Eureka Elenora stood from 1728 to 1911. It's a rite of passage to Swedenborg Gardens, a destination proudly advertised on a strip of white-painted tin, East End Homes. The stake through the heart of John Williams has flowered and withered and flowered again, and the thing crushed in the pit is a fetal lump kicking against rubble and choking in clay. I'm struck by a phrase highlighted by Michael Taussig in Shamanism, Colonialism and the Wild Man. It is the presence of their absence, their presence in their absence, and that is the paradox that I pursue. In the past, I focused on the chipped grey font, the only trace of the Swedish Church, and I imagined the body of the church as being somehow behind it, which was quite wrong. The granite plinth, its bowl and its stem, defied time. It looked like a strategically grooved naval weapon. It was imprinted with an image of the church, ready to be swept away on a kind of raft, but there was no water. The dry bowl into which the supplicants could dip a finger was filled with a shingle of corroded coins. Standing here now looking east, I see that the proportions of the church are represented by a raised and fenced garden. A London plane tree of character, mottled and peeling and yellow in this light, marks the ground where Swedenborg was interred. It doesn't, of course. His legend is commemorated in white paint on a black border. Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688-1772, a Swedish theologian and polymath, lodged nearby in Wellclose Square. He's buried here. Dry leaves, crisped and curling like the burnt pages of a parchment diary, pile up behind the black frame. What's curious too is that I was invited, before all the coronavirus kicked in, to go to Stockholm to look at the summer house, Swedenborg's summer house, where he held converse with some of the notable dead. They turned up to have seances with him, and it was a very interesting piece of local architecture, a shed, a garden shed of consequence with an upper deck, a pointed roof, and it was another of these ones that was there and it was not there. You know, I looked for it in the site where it had originally been, which was the real site, which was, you can gain access to a little strip of ground, something like this, totally surrounded on all sides by flats. And there appears to be the Lusthaus at the end of the grounds, standing as it was, but it's the wrong one. It's a fake. It's been put there, you know, as a representation, a memory prompt of something that was real, but it couldn't have any of the actual resonance of his presence within it. It was as if we built a kind of balsa wood version of the church and put it there. You'd think it was it, but it's not it. The real summer house was removed and was taken by cart or lorry or whatever across to the Skansen Park, which is a kind of park representing Swedish rural history. And there it stands in the wrong place, in a kind of ground like this, which is more or less the proportions of the real garden. So you've got the real house in the false place, the false house in the real place, and the organ from the original house is still in it, on which contemporary composers are doing Swedenborgian performances. And then there's a third one from a breakaway Swedenborgian sect, which is shoehorned down the side of the church, in which they have meetings on summer evenings, which is a kind of big Swedish tradition. And I was there in the coldest time of winter, skidding about on ice between these three sites which nobody else was visiting, and it was one of the most curious experiences to try and locate where is history authenticated, where does structure begin and end. And the curators who were giving me the stories were all themselves quite interestingly damaged and voluble, and trying to talk about everything else except the summer houses. So the summer houses are kind of eradicated from the story until it emerges in a book published by Swedenborg House, which I'm fascinated to see. And we've got the same problems here as to how do we keep history as an active thing? How do we get people to engage with it? How does it work? How do we sustain that sense of renewal that the city got from the river? People like Swedenborg arriving here, many, many more. And they're all, the histories of them are all in these scattered pieces of ground. You go to what was once Victoria Park Cemetery, which is not in Victoria Park, but is south of Roman Road. There's the original arch, which VPC, Victoria Park Cemetery, and the cemetery has been changed into a public park, something like this. The original history was pretty bad. There was huge numbers of people in common burial pits, incredibly insanitary. One of the things that led to the setting up of Victoria Park proper as a green lung to have space for people. But a burial there was of the first Aboriginal cricket team, Australian Aboriginal cricket team, came to England, and before an Australian white cricket team came, incidentally. And on that tour, a man who they named King Cole, which is a sort of derisory title for this Aboriginal man, died and was buried in Victoria Park Cemetery. And when this happened, they commemorated it when a contemporary in the 80s Australian Aboriginal team came here. They had a ceremony which I went to, and they planted a eucalyptus tree and a brass plaque that told the story alongside it. I think the brass plaque was stolen in about 2 days. It was gone, and the eucalyptus tree died. But there's another one there. They've replanted another one. But the idea of this tree was that it would represent a kind of dream time, a song line, a way that you could walk the city and recover the story. And so it was an enormous inspiration to me. And I go back there to look at this spot from time to time. A new plaque is there now, so the story is held, but it's kind of on the edges of disappearance. And the idea of that song line, the idea of being able to move from site to site to site across the gardens of the city, gives us something very special to London. And it wouldn't exist without the people that have come here repeatedly. And also, of course, the ones that sail out, like Cook, whose son, James Cook's eldest son was christened in Shadwell, St Paul's Church, just across there. Those references, it was a Mariners' Church, known as the Mariners' Church, because this is riverine London. This is it. De Quincey's descriptions of the highway are amazingly, they're completely full of this kind of sense of exoticism and the dangers of exoticism, and the city as a port. And we probably don't want to lose that. I think that's really important. And I don't think we want to lose our own dreams and myths and songlines of the city either. And so every time you come back to the same place, you can't go into the same place twice. It's like the river. It's always revised. It's always revised by the people you meet, by the stories you hear. So I've added in today this now new sense of where the church was, new sense of where Swedenborg was buried, new sense of how this church links to George in the East, to the Danish church, on down to St Anne's Limehouse, how they link to the river and the apple tree there. And that sort of, in a sense, confirms my earlier vision of the theologian, scientist, mystic coming in here and sitting and resting and communicating before he goes out to engage with the city, to achieve his writing, and indeed in the end to die here. And I think his last great work was lost, so there's a sense of lost works, lost heads, new sites recovered. I'll just end by reading a little piece that came from a book before I knew the true story, but with the sense that I had already of this place as being a wild orchard. What he discovered survives to this day: a wild orchard, a thatch of white blossom, a tangle of broken boughs, thorns, couch grass, berries. Between Cable Street and the highway, close to Well-Close Square, a green tunnel, a grove sequestered from the open ground in which is buried the rubble of the Swedish Church, Eureka, Elenora. Persistent exploration locates a grey stone font on which the church is depicted as a black ark, a hostage to the Furies. Swedenborg was buried in a vault beneath the altar. In 1908, his body was exhumed and returned to Uppsala. Once more upon the northern ocean, the skull, so it is fabled, was mislaid. Does it wink beneath the bar of the Sewerman's pub, the Crown and Dolphin, with other contraband trophies, the caput of John Williams, the defaulting gangsters, and the bone lanterns of London's disappeared? This young man, the stranger, lies on coarse grass. His back rests against a gnarled apple tree. Dappled sunlight, shadow play on white outstretched hands. Swedenborg's soul is resolved into discrete points of motion. It is of one substance with the sun. He is diffused, lost, estranged from himself. No longer does he converse with the legions of the dead. He died here, and he became one of them. And then he raised himself up. He brushed his long black jacket, and he walked away, leaving his hat hanging on a tree. And I think the garden and the tree were very significant to Swedenborg. He writes about the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and the significance of the moment of eating the apple, and the responsibility of knowledge that comes with that. And I think we have that same kind of responsibility to the natural world and to the things of the natural world, to not lose touch with them, not lose touch with that knowledge as we gain and push forward in the real politic world of business and enterprise and global corporations. The noise, the other stuff is still there, and it relies on small groups of interested people to keep in touch with it. And I think I mentioned at the start the Mary Matfelon Church, how that became revised and lost its name. It was known as the Mary Matfelon Park, became the Altab Ali Park in 1978 in memory of a British Bangladeshi man who was murdered on the streets there at a time of great racial tension, which I remember. And so the park became something else entirely, and the things I was mentioning disappeared. But set into the path that runs through the park is a quotation from Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, the Bengali poet. And what it says is, "The shade of my tree is offered to those who come and go fleetingly." I think that's the same thing again. I think the tree, the shade, the ability to stop and sit and wait is what's available to us in all of these places where absence is foregrounded and where we recover memories that we didn't know that we owned. Thank you.